These 3 weeks, the last two, and then today, we're doing what I'm considering a kind of a series that has to do with the middle section of True Refuge, the book that's coming out. It's called The Gateway of Love. And on the first class we did was really how do we begin to forgive ourselves and open our hearts to our own being when we've locked into being at war. And the second class was how do we open that forgiving heart to others. And tonight is really on this theme of how do we embrace our life? How do we really fall in love with life without holding back our love in any way? And the underlying understanding is of love as a refuge, that no matter what comes up in our lives, no matter how much pain or how much beauty, it's this heart, when it's open, that has space for this living, dying world. So the solstice is a powerful time of year to explore what it means to open our hearts. I mean, I think everybody has this notion of, yes, opening hearts is good. But there's something, and it's especially around the northern hemisphere now, the shortest day of the year, and throughout the world there's these holidays that in some way are honoring the reality that we go through these seasons of outer and inner periods where it gets dark. And there are really two kinds of darkness if you reflect on it. And one of the darknesses is what you might sense the darkness of a kind of the fertile void. It's the winter where the seeds are underground. We can't see what's there. There's a kind of silence and a stillness or a seeming lack of activity, out of which arises new life. And it's a beautiful kind of a darkness and silence and stillness. And there's something instinctual in us that kind of knows that there's a power to getting more still and touching into that and letting then more of the creativity and truth of what we are blossom into springtime. So that's one of the kinds of darkness. And the other kind of darkness, which is also a very real part of our conditioning, is the unconsciousness and the ignorance that gives rise to violence, gives rise to greed, gives rise to hatred. And this is the kind of violence that we see, let's say, in this week in Connecticut, that one friend described as the destruction of innocence. Yeah. That breaks our heart because it's so, we relate to it in such again, a kind of a instinctual way. It's heartbreak. And I've been reading, even before this week, I've been reading about the Congo. And, it's been in the newspaper a lot, but somehow or other we don't get the riveting attention. The killing fields in the Congo are the worst since World War II. Hundreds of thousands of children are right now deemed at risk for either being raped or recruited into armies or killed and displaced. Their families are gone. It's horrific. And then we read about, the ongoing violence in the inner city, that more African American children lose their lives to shootings, inner city, than anything else. So there's this inquiry that goes on that, we begin to wake up and sense, well, how does our hearts hold this? And how can we hold the most recent violence in our country that has really broken us open and sense these are our children? Because for me, this is my child, And how do we think of the Congo? These are our children. And the children in the inner city, these are our children. That's the inquiry. How, when the darkness is thick, Again, this is really what our practice. How do we call on the light? So what is it that helps to wake us up, and knowing that the same darkness is in every heart? What serves to wake us up? What will help us wake each other up in a way that lets us inhabit our full potential, lets our hearts break open so there is that openness and that love that senses everybody as part of our hearts? What serves that awakening? So what I'd like to do tonight is explore two pathways that are both, I think, ways that we pay attention that help us to touch truth and free our hearts. And I love the expression to love without holding back, because I think each one of us can sense that we hold back, that out of fear, that there's a love that's possible, and out of fear, our hearts get armored and we hold back. So there's two pathways. And one pathway I sometimes describe as not averting our gaze. That when there is suffering, when there's pain, not to look away, whether it's our own or others. I was thinking about Ram Dass. Many of you know Baba Ram Dass, who for many years, for this generation, I think, of spiritual seekers, is one of the first that he wrote Be Here Now, and he really has taught so much about the practices of presence. Well, he was teaching a course in Oakland some years ago, and it was a series of classes on how to serve from that presence. And one woman at the end of the series reported that the classes had profoundly affected her life, and she described how every day in the morning for years in this area, she would walk to work and pass the metro station. There was a homeless person that always was kind of camped out there, so she'd put money into a cup. This happened day after day after day. And then she described how she realized recently that she had never looked him in the eye. She had never looked him in the eye. And she was afraid to. And then when she started to inquire, well, why am I afraid to look him in the eye? What she realized is because if I really looked at him, he'd be sleeping on my living room couch. So in some way we're afraid. We avert our gaze because we're afraid of being overwhelmed, we're afraid of being powerless. And yet if we look away, it actually increases suffering. So there's this invitation or calling on this spiritual path of awakening the heart to have the courage to look right into the source of the suffering, to sense that deep down there's a feeling of separation. If we're willing to slow down and feel it, a feeling of fear. And if we're not touching that, if we're not courageous enough to touch the fear and the sense of separation, what happens is we don't touch the place that's really the source of our caring. So our compassion gets abstract. We can respond to things, and unless they completely hit us over the head, we don't completely avert our gaze. We kind of take in the information, but we're not willing to really touch where the pain is, so we don't touch where our heart's tenderness is. And we're not able to respond and inhabit our wholeness. Jesus said, if you bring forth what is within you, what is within you will save you. If you do not bring forth what is within you, what is within you will destroy you. Now, I think that's really a powerful statement, because it refers to the language I often turn to as unlived life. That if we don't bring forth the aliveness and tenderness that's within us, that bottled up, unlived life leaves us cut off and suffering. We stay asleep. We're disconnected from the awareness that's here. So out of unlived life, out of that cut-offness, violence. We don't violate when we feel connected. We just don't. What comes out from that cut-offness is greed. We don't have to grasp on if we feel connected. I love the teaching that if you remember the ocean, you can trust all the waves, you know? And if you don't remember that you're the ocean, you get seasick every day. But isn't that true? That to the degree that we feel separate, we're seasick. We're kind of uncomfortable. We're upset, and then we react. And when it gets really severe, we react in ways that can feel really horrible. So what we find is that one of our main ways of sleepwalking, of averting our gaze and keeping away from that core feelings, is to then get aggressive. When we don't touch the fear, we get either aggressive or we are in some way running away. And in this culture, you can feel it. We're a nation that celebrates violence. I mean, I think of Rambo and Terminator and what really attracts us around the world. The Americans are thought of as cowboys. We solve all our problems with guns. It's just the reputation. And in a more subtle way, there's judgment. I mean, if it's not the physical gun, it's the aggression of judgment. That we all, when we're honest, know how many moments our minds have that form of violence, of creating separation. So when we don't face what's inside us, what happens really is a kind of developmental arrest, where the limbic system and reptilian brain, the parts of us that are in fight flight, basically are dominating. If we don't face what's in us, it's developmental arrest. Then there's the cycles of violence. This is last year, a woman that lives in Uganda sent me an email, and she said that she takes a weekend trip periodically to Rwanda, and she visits the Genocide Memorial Center there. And she described this quote engraved on a plaque in the Memorial Center that struck her so much that she wanted me to know about it, and I've read it a few times. And it's by a man whose name was Felician Nakajengwa, and I'm sure I am not pronouncing it right. He said this: "If you knew me and you really knew yourself, you would not have killed me." Okay, so if we touch what's here, if we don't avert our gaze to what's here inside us and inside each other, there's a connection then. We will not cause harm. So much of our practice is really training not to avert our gaze. I mean, I really think of much of the practice of mindful presence is this it's a courageous training, and just stay with what's here, even when it's hard. And we start finding that the more we stay, the more we realize we can handle it, and not only that, we find in staying that there's a presence that has space and compassion and creativity and humor and perspective. I mean, we come home to a refuge. But our conditioning is not to want to. So it takes a kind of training. And yet we have the capacity to. I mean, our most recently evolved part of our brain has the capacity to be mindful of its own conditioning. The most recently evolved part of our brain has the capacity to be empathetic, to be compassionate. You know, Mother Teresa said it so memorably, we have this capacity to see Christ in that distressing disguise. We can see past the veil. This is our capacity. So the key is training our attention and being committed to it. And I was thinking about that and thinking about children. I remember my son, when for his 6th birthday, I gave him an ant farm. And it probably was the smartest present I ever gave him, because he was absolutely fascinated in this. He would just watch, and this again, I'm thinking of a meditative environment. Like, he was so engaged with watching these ants build their little tunnels and their graveyards. I remember they have a graveyard, and they would drag their comrades to the graveyard. He couldn't believe it when he first showed me an ant dragging another ant to put it in the graveyard. He really was in it. And I remember picking him up from school one day, and he got into the car, and he was really, really upset. And he told me that in the playground, kids were stamping on ants. And that he could not understand how they could do it. And he kept trying to make them stop, and they wouldn't stop. And as I reflected on this, I was remembering that, just this sense of, I can't remember who said it, that attention is the deepest expression of love. And it wakes up love. Whatever we pay attention to, if we really give it our attention, we discover in that presence that it's part of us. We know how we feel about our dogs, and then everybody else's dog's really a nice dog, but our dog is this special, It's because we've paid so much attention that the sentience of that being has become part of our hearts. It just happens. So it's a training in attention, and whatever we pay attention to, we connect with, but it's very hard when what we're paying attention to is filled with suffering, whether it's our own suffering or another. It's very hard to stay with our own loneliness, our feelings of shame, when we feel in some way like a failure. And when we can avoid it, we will. So we find that when we do pay attention, either because we're forced to or our training, like happened this week for so many of us around the country, we couldn't not pay attention. It broke our hearts open. Our goodness, we could touch our goodness because there was such sincerity and is such sincerity. I could feel it with so many of you as we were starting in tonight. It's in the room. There's just more inhabiting the fullness of who we are, more tenderness. So we know that it's there, and yet it's hard for us to open to. I thought I'd share that, for myself, when I first heard the news about Newtown, I was jarred, stunned, horrified, teared up some. It wasn't until I got really quiet and I started thinking of my son at 6, at 5. I remembered a picture of him that I completely broke down. There's something about when it's personal that our brains are designed to connect and relate. And I think our potential is to widen the circle of what feels personal, so that truly we get to, they're all our children, all of them, the ones in the Congo, the ones in the inner city, the ones in Connecticut, that we're all a part of each other's hearts. That's our potential. So I started by talking about developmental arrest, that we avert our eyes. The training is to stay and pay attention. But the good news in this, I think, is that as much as there's been developmental arrest, or more, it seems that as a species, we are getting better. And I'm encouraging many people to read Steven Pinker's book, Better Angels of Our Nature, which I've only read pieces of. And I'm just curious, how many of you are familiar with it or have started reading some? I'm seeing a scattering of hands, yeah. He goes through human history, and he really talks about how much violence there's been and how much evidence there is that there's less, that we're having fewer wars, that there's improved conditions for most subjugated minorities, less people are being killed. So we fix on what's wrong, and it's still a huge amount of violence and injustice, and yet there's a movement in a certain direction. And I feel like the fact that more and more people are practicing training their attention to come back into the moment, to be with what's difficult, to open our hearts to each other, is probably the most beautiful and encouraging sign of this. Okay, so one of the trainings is don't avert the gaze. Keep, kind of paying attention. The second training is to include the goodness in our gaze. Because our conditioning is to fix on the trouble. So we have this deeply built-in capacity for collaboration, for empathy, for compassion. We see it in kindnesses all the time, to include that. I mean, not to get arrogant about the progress us humans are making. Some of you might remember that study last year. I mean, I spoke about it in here in Chicago about rats and empathy. Some of you remember that? That when one rat was trapped in a kind of a small pen, another rat, when it was given a treat, saved part of its treat to give to the other rat. I mean, empathy. So, they've got it. Even the rats have that capacity, us too. And then, of course, as humans, we get the spiritual ego thing that, you can even see it in reality shows this week on The Amazing Race to Enlightenment. Can Jim and Susie achieve right mindfulness? And will Barb and Candy be eliminated for relentless clinging to the self, So, we tend to fixate, and even on ourselves, when we, in some way, when we start, I often will ask, just to think of kindnesses you've done. Sometimes we'll do a kind of a hand raise and sharing, and often what comes out of when we think, well, when have I done something kind? Inevitably we find, but there were mixed motives. I was kind of doing my good personhood project, or, it's very hard. I remember that story about some children in a school bus, and one of them brought a handful of peanuts up to the driver, and he said, "Oh, thank you very much." And they were sharing with him. And when the little girl went back, and kids were talking and doing their thing, and she came back with another handful, and he goes, "Wow, that's they're sharing." Third time, he says, No, honey, you keep the peanuts for yourself and your friends." And she said, "Oh, that's okay. We're just sucking the chocolate off of them." So sure, we have mixed motives, but there's still some benevolence in it. Okay, so this second training, being willing to include in our gaze the goodness, to see past the veils, it both familiarizes us with goodness, and it helps us really not only trust it in ourselves and each other, but it calls it forth. And I think that's the most important piece. I remember, this is probably now about 10, 12 years ago, I participated in a teachers' meeting at Spirit Rock on the West Coast. And the Dalai Lama was attending, and he was sitting there, and I was really lucky. I got to sit right up front, and I got to watch how he interacted with people and how every single person that he was with felt special, because every single person he just saw in them and treated them with a tremendous respect and care. And it was interesting. One friend described him going to a hotel, and before he left, he asked that everybody that had helped in some way, including those that had cleaned the rooms and those that had cooked the foods, he had them all there so he could thank them and say goodbye to them. And even the Secret Service, and these are Secret Service guys that had protected all sorts of dignitaries and, well-known politicians and so on. They said that they loved to be with the Dalai Lama, and the reason why was because he treats us as if we really matter. We're special. He really, every single person. Soon after that meeting, I remember coming home and seeing a picture of him hugging Jesse Helms in the newspaper. It was very sweet. There's a quote that says, "Saints are what they are, not because their sanctity makes them admirable to others, but because the gift of sainthood makes it possible for them to admire everyone else." Seeing with the eyes of the divine, seeing past the veil. So we look at each other, and yes, we see the particular body form, and yes, we see the personality and the conditioning, but we see who's looking through those eyes. And we see the heart that's tender, that has this incredible capacity for loving. We see that. Nelson Mandela says it never hurts to think too highly of a person. Often they become ennobled and act better because of it. Isn't it so? I think of this as parenting. This would be like parenting 101. If we could remember the goodness, really see the goodness, really let children know we see the goodness. That's who they are, it comes out. It brings it out. But it's not only Nelson Mandela and the Dalai Lama. It's not just saints that are capable of recognizing goodness. It's in each of us. Each of us cherishes goodness. So a short story for you. Dante was standing near the Ponte Vecchio. Am I saying it right? It's the bridge. Does anybody know? Vecchio. Boy, I cremated that one. I have a reputation for bad pronunciation. Ponte Vecchio? Thank you. A bridge that crosses the Arno River in Florence. It was just before 1300. Okay? Dante saw Beatrice standing on the bridge. He was a young man, she even younger, and that vision contained the whole of eternity for him. Dante did not speak to her and saw her very little. And then Beatrice died, carried off by the plague. Dante was stricken with the loss of his vision. She was the connection between his soul and heaven itself. 650 years later, during World War II, the Americans were chasing the German army up the Italian peninsula. The Germans were blowing up everything of aid to the progression of the American army, including the bridges across the Arno River. But no one wanted to blow up Ponte Vecchio because Beatrice had stood on it and Dante had written about it. So the German army made radio contact with the Americans, and in plain language they said they would leave Ponte Vecchio intact if the Americans would promise not to use it. The promise held. The bridge was not blown up, and not one American soldier or piece of equipment went across it. We're such hard-bidden people that we need hard-bidden proof of things, and this is the most hard-bidden fact I know to present you. The bridge was spared in a modern, ruthless war because Beatrice had stood upon it. There's something in every human heart that perceives goodness, loves goodness, really wants that goodness to flow through. There's something in us that wants that, that longs for that.